it will be embedded in the muscle. It's designed that way on purpose because there's no pressure there. So muscle contraction facilitates blood flow. If you leave a patient in a bed and the blood doesn't move in their leg, they will develop a blood clot called a deep vein thrombosis. So they'll oftentimes put cuffs around their legs and squeeze their legs to keep the blood moving because the pressure in the legs is so low. And the reason for that, anatomically, is the differences in the smooth muscle lines. Now, the externa is connective tissue, and you already knew that already. This is in part a reeler, packaging blood vessels that you saw before. Capillary beds are primarily simple squamous epithelium only. A capillary is, in anatomy essence, a blood vessel without all its outer coverings. So you can see the smooth muscle and the connective tissue has been stripped away here for the capillary. And the flow from the arterial system into the venous system is also regulated by smooth muscles. So they're not drawn on here, and I'll do a lot more of this in physiology with you as we talk about the regulation of blood pressure and blood flow. It turns out you don't have enough blood in your body to deal with everything all the time. So we have these very elegant shunting systems, arteriovenous shunt systems, where we can regulate the amount of blood that flows through a given capillary bed. And those are done by smooth muscle valves, if you will, places where you can squeeze off the vessel. So every capillary bed is, on its arterial side, associated with a number of smooth muscle bands called precapillary sphincters. It's not on the picture. You should probably write that down. I'm sorry I'm not putting all of this on there. These precapillary sphincters are found on the edges of the capillary beds, and they respond to autonomic information. So the precapillary sphincter regulates how much blood goes through a given capillary bed. Now let's just do one example and we'll leave it. And then I'm going to teach you some nervous system stuff. One example. If blood comes along to a capillary bed and you are having a situation in your life where you are highly relaxed, laying on the couch, there is no need for human performance of any kind. What do you need in terms of blood flow to the skeletal muscles in comparison with the blood flow to the digestive system?
Your digestive system is going to need more.
Yeah. So this is what I'm about to introduce to you. This is what we call the rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system stuff. We want the digestive system working right now, handling what we've just eaten for lunch or whatever else. Now, what happens if you go outside? If you go outside with your cousins and your brothers and your sisters and your family members after lunch, and you're going to play a game of flag football? Okay, now where does the blood need to go? To your muscles, okay? So you don't get to do both. The precapillary sphincters then will close off many of the capillary beds, shunting them through one path in the digestive system, allowing the capillaries and the skeletal muscles to fill up with blood to provide the needed oxygen and energy for the muscle contraction. And so our blood is actually shunted to the places where we need it most. We don't have enough to do everything all the time. And that's done by smooth muscle precapillary sphincters associated with capillary beds. All right, that's all I wanted to say about blood vessels and that. Now this slide, I went ahead this morning and put it in every time I make a transition. You'll see this slide 4 or 5 times from this class before test 1. And then in the spring, you'll see this slide at least 6 more times. So if I were you and I was going to be in anatomy and physiology, I'd just go ahead and learn to reproduce this picture. It has so much valuable information on it. Okay, so the first thing you notice over here is some things I've said. The somatic nervous system is primarily concerned with the control of skeletal muscle. And now, what can you tell me? This picture doesn't show it. What can you tell me already about the way the somatic nervous system communicates with skeletal muscle? What does the anatomy at the skeletal muscle look like? I'll let you look at the picture while you describe it. what does the anatomy at the skeletal muscle cell look like? Does it look like the anatomy at the connection in the autonomic nervous system to the smooth muscle? It does not. Can you describe the difference?
Looks like a plug.
I like that description. It looks like a plug.
It's more superficial. It doesn't look like it's going deep
On the skeletal or the smooth?
on the skeleton. It is.
Okay, what do you mean? It doesn't look like it's... Okay, so I like the plug description. In fact, these things all have very famous names, and we'll want to work them out as we tear down the skeletal muscle. This is the all-important, all-famous neuromuscular junction, where the somatic nervous system communicates with skeletal muscle. And you can see it is highly specific. This is not a varicosity. This is not just pouring the chemical out over a bunch of cells. This is delivering the chemical to one place on the muscle. Very specific stuff here for the neuromuscular junction. And notice the end of the somatic motor neuron here, I'm using words that are important here, the end of the somatic motor neuron here does not make contact with the muscle cell membrane, which we will continue to call the sarcolemma. That will be the word that I will use. The sarcolemma here does not make contact. Instead, there's a gap there. There's a synapse or a gap. And the somatic motor neuron has to deliver a chemical across that gap in order to get the muscle to contract. Now, this picture shows you what that chemical is. It is acetylcholine. Now, these axons that connect to these skeletal muscles also have insulation on them. So what do they look like? They're white matter. Yeah, they're axons. So I wonder where I might find those. We're going to learn this pathway coming, right? We're going to see it. So where might I find those guys? In a spinal cord section. Is it going to be in that middle dark area, or is it going to be around the edges? Around the edges. So the sensory one we saw already was the anterior spinal thalamic tract from the Pacinian corpuscles right in here. This one, the only one you're going to learn in test 1, is this one over here in a structure called the lateral funiculus. This is where the information is that's coming from the brain to the muscle in an area called the lateral funiculus. So you just think about what you should get excited about this. Think about what you're already being able to do. If you see a lesion on a spinal cord, and that lesion is in one of these critical locations that I'm about to describe to you, on the lateral side, you know immediately what's going on here. And after you have learned the actual individual pathways, if you tell me what spinal cord section that lesion is in, I can tell you what muscle's not contracted. So this is something to get excited about, being able to look at these things. And now this is your first introduction to it. This is a little spot right here, a little bundle of axons, a highway, a somatic highway, carrying information down the spinal cord to the muscle. And it looks like this. It's myelinated, it's white matter, it's in the lateral funiculus, and it releases a chemical called acetylcholine. Now, the autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And notice the anatomy of these two divisions is different. So if you learn it here, when I show it to you on the other slide, you'll pick it up really quick. Notice that the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are really described in terms of what we call a ganglion. So this gives me an opportunity to introduce to you what a ganglion is. In fact, you have already heard this word. Where have you heard this word ganglion already? What? The dorsal root ganglia. What kind of information is there? Nervous. What kind of nervous information? Sensory information. Yeah. So I brought that up with the fibrocartilage story. Okay? So I didn't tell you at that point, but now it'll make good sense to you. That's a little ball of cells. Remember we described as a ball of cells there? A ganglion is by definition a cluster of neuronal cell bodies. And we have them all over our bodies. Clusters of neuronal cell bodies with particular specific connections and functions. clusters of neuronal cell bodies. In fact, it is the language of the ganglia that we use to describe the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. It's all ganglia language. Now, as we progress in the nervous system later, this will come after the first muscle test, okay? As we progress later, you will learn that there are places in your brain that are clusters of neuronal cell bodies. If you look at a section of human brain, let me ask it to you this way, the question you know. If I made a section of the cerebral cortex, and I looked at the neurons there, what would they look like?
Say it again.
If I made a section of cerebral cortex, is it white or gray? It's gray. So it's mostly neuronal cell bodies, right? What do they look like? Okay, that's where this is going ultimately, good, but I'm thinking more about the anatomy of the specific neurons. You know it's cortex when you look at it because it looks
Brain?
like teardrops. Now remember the pyramid cells?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it tells you the cortex. And so wherever you go in the brain, there's tips for you on how you can identify various areas. For example, if I was in the cerebellum, I would see a molecular layer, a granular layer, and in between, a Purkinje cell layer, these beautiful Purkinje neurons. So I did that on purpose. You can see there are ways to tell anatomically when you're looking at these things. And so all over the brain, this is where I was going with this, you have these clusters of neuronal cell bodies that have very specific connections, pathways, and functions. And you're going to be prone to call them ganglia because of what you're learning here. And in fact, when I sat in this room and took anatomy, that was in the fall of 1986. And I sat right there. In fact, I think it's the same desk. They have not been replaced in 40 years. Dr. Sappington was teaching anatomy, and he taught us that the cluster of neuronal cell bodies deep in the cerebral hemisphere is called the basal ganglia. And if you get taught one day at the medical school in New Orleans, if you go down there and do any kind of clinical training in the summer, if you take Gross, you'll have Schwartz and Whitworth, and you'll have them in the fall if you're in medical school. They're going to call them the basal ganglia because they're old guys. But the terminology in anatomy has changed. Now, we call a cluster of neuronal cell bodies outside the brain or spinal cord a ganglion. You heard dorsal root ganglion? And now I'm going to tell you about these autonomic ganglia. But if you have a cluster of neuronal cell bodies in the brain or spinal cord, those are called a nucleus. You see how that's a problem? Because if you ask most people what a nucleus is, they say, that's the place where the DNA is. It has a double phospholipid bilayer and nuclear pores. That's where the nucleus is. But that is not what a nervous system person means. When a neuron guy says nucleus, they mean a cluster of maybe, like in the biological clock, for example, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That is really a cluster of about 25,000 neuronal cell bodies in your brain, split on either side of the third ventricle. So language is important. Ganglion, nuclei. Now, the autonomic nervous system is described in terms of its ganglia. So I'm going to say the words, and you're all going to look at me, and your eyes are going to roll back in your head. But you're going to need to get to where you can say this. You're going to get to where this is very comfortable for you. I'm going to say it, and then I'll explain it. For the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic cell bodies are located in the spinal cord from T1 to L2. Is that gray or white? It's going to be gray. Yeah. They're located in the spinal cord. Those preganglionic cell bodies send their axons, called the preganglionic projections, into ganglion cells alongside the spinal cord, where they synapse. Then the ganglion cells send their axons, we call these postganglionic projections, out to the particular targets. You know, like the smooth muscle in a blood vessel, or a gland, or the heart. Now, the reason this postganglionic projection here is dotted is because this is a very unique piece of anatomy. Most of the axons in our bodies are myelinated, with two exceptions. The postganglionic projections of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So these are unmyelinated and these are unmyelinated. Okay, so here's the language one more time. Preganglionic cell bodies of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system are located in the spinal cord between T1 and L2. They send projections into ganglion cells. Those ganglion cells then send their postganglionic projections, which are not myelinated, to the smooth muscle of blood vessels, glands, and heart. That is the core anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system. You see how everything bounces off the ganglion language? Preganglionic projections that are myelinated, preganglionic cell bodies, ganglion cells that have postganglionic projections. So everything is ganglion, 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 ganglion. And later, when we get to it, I'm going to make you learn where all of these ganglia are. Okay, and I'm going to remind you, remember that day for test 1 where I was teaching you the differences between ganglia and nuclei? Okay, you feel like you can do it? Preganglionic, postganglionic? All right, now notice the anatomy here. One more piece, and then we'll do parasympathetic. The preganglionic projections of the sympathetic nervous system tend to be short. Let me show you. This is a slide right here. Right, we have to do this multiple times. So I've got a bunch of them in here. This is a slide of the sympathetic anatomy. And before I'm done with it, you're going to know all this, okay? So we're just getting our feet wet. Notice that the preganglionic cell bodies of the sympathetic, this is the fourth time I've said it, the preganglionic cell bodies of the sympathetic nervous system, of the autonomic nervous system, have their cell bodies located in the spinal cord between T1 and L2. You see it? T1 and L2. They send their preganglionic myelinated projections out to the ganglia. And there they are. You see the little balls of cells there? Those are called the sympathetic chain ganglia, or individual ganglia, and they have names. And so the preganglionic projections go to the ganglia, and then they send their postganglionic projections, which are predominantly, why is it dotted? Not myelinated, out to the targets. Compare the distance that the preganglionic projection has to go with the distance the postganglionic projection has to go. Give me the words short and long. Where do those belong? Preganglionic is short, postganglionic is long. Okay, so there's the picture right there. Preganglionic is short, postganglionic is long. All right. Now here's the language of the parasympathetic. The preganglionic projections of the parasympathetic nervous system, of the autonomic nervous system, have their cell bodies located in the brain and in the sacral divisions of the spinal cord. In the brain and the sacral divisions, okay? So these two things are in different places. If it's sympathetic information, where does it start? Okay, we're back on you. Sympathetic. If it's sympathetic, where does it start? What? Between T1 and L2 in the spinal cord. You see that? Okay, if it's parasympathetic, where does it start? In the brain and the sacral divisions of the spinal cord. All right, so learn these terms. It'll help you read this. Oftentimes, sympathetics are called thoracolumbar. You see why? Parasympathetic anatomies are referred to as craniosacral. You see why? Brain and sacral. So this is go back to the parasympathetic. This is the parasympathetic, and you're going to have to learn all these as well. In fact, for test 2, I'm going to cut the head open and show you where every one of these parasympathetic ganglia are. You need to be able to describe with words where the ciliary ganglion is. Where's the pterygopalatine ganglion? Where's the submandibular ganglion? You need to know where these are. So notice that the preganglionic parasympathetic projections are associated with the structures in the brain and spinal cord. Now, what structures in the brain are the parasympathetic preganglionics associated with? Cranial nerves. A lot of times in anatomy you just have to memorize. And the nerves are gobs and gobs to come. Y'all learn them right now. The nerves are 3, 7, 9, and 10. By name, the oculomotor, the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. 3, 7, 9, and 10. 4 cranial nerves carry parasympathetic information. Huge for autonomics. Your first introduction. Cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Now, compare for me this time, if you will, the differences in the preganglionic and postganglionic projections. Just look at cranial nerve 10. Look at 10 and where it goes. So if I start in the vagal nuclei in the brainstem, and I'm on Miss Frizzle's bus, do I go a long way or a short way before I get to a gap that I have to jump? I go a long way. Y'all see that? Where are the ganglia of the parasympathetic nervous system?
Brain in the sacrum.
Okay, they're in the brain. I see those. They're in the head. Okay, so I'll grant you that. But just look at the vagus. Where are the ganglia? They're at the targets. Y'all see that? How is that different from the sympathetic arrangement?
Sympathetics are at the spinal cord.
Yes. All the sympathetic ganglia lie alongside the spinal cord in a chain, like a necklace laid down on each side of the cord. All the ganglion, all the clusters of cell bodies that control digestion and heart and respiration and liver function and on, those ganglia are located typically at the target.
That's so we can control it easier?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, you don't have less or more control with this compared to sympathetics. But it's an interesting observation. It's an anatomy that you have to know. I don't know that I can explain to you the why here, functionally, but it is very interesting.
Does it have to do with the hormones that it sends out?
Well, so it's true. They release chemicals, and we're gonna beat that horse to death in physiology what these chemicals do. But I don't think you should get bogged down in the why for the anatomy here. Now, developmentally, I can explain to you why it is where it is, and that I'm going to bring that up when I do the adrenal gland later, because the adrenal gland medulla thinks he's a sympathetic chain ganglia cluster because he came from the neural crest, so they came from the same place. But I don't think you should get bogged down at this point. It's important for you to get the base structure here. So we're going to spend most of our times here with the somatics, but we just talked about the smooth muscle of blood vessels, so it's fair enough to introduce to you the language of the ganglia and the sympathetic and parasympathetic projections. You got the core of that. Now, last thing here, for the anatomy of blood vessels, and I'm going to shut up. We looked at blood vessel walls, and we know now that blood vessels, glands, and cardiac muscle are all considered part of autonomics. They're all involuntary. Most of the time, y'all, the vast majority of the time, if a structure has parasympathetic information there, it will also have sympathetic information there. Where one activates, the other deactivates, and vice versa. For example, parasympathetics on the heart make it slow down. Sympathetics make it speed up. So if you learn this terminology, you don't have to memorize all of those. And here it is. Fight or flight versus rest and digest. Sympathetics are fight and flight, survival. Parasympathetics are rest and digest. So the illustration I gave you just a moment ago about the redistribution of blood will make more sense to you if you learn those two systems in that context. Okay, now I'm going back to, when we start class next time, I'm going back to this one. I'm going back to the somatic nervous system, and we're going to beat that one to death for a little bit before we start talking about muscle anatomy.